Let's start out by having each member of the panel discuss what their definition of consciousness hacking is, and maybe just briefly stating that definition, but also giving each member just a little bit of an opportunity to bring their particular background to that definition.
I guess I'll start. I'm very interested in how we use how technologies are not just literal, but they're also metaphorical, that we use technology as a way to model and understand the world. My first book, called TechGnosis, was about the way in which technologies, and particularly media technologies, have shaped and structured the religious imagination and even religious experience for the last 2,000 years, but mostly concentrating on the 20th century. So I'm very interested in the sort of technological origins of the word hacking, at least in its contemporary sense of the term. We first see it arise in the 1960s in the MIT computer labs, and it sort of suggests this first turn away from the, back then the computers were these enormous machines that took up whole rooms and had to be air conditioned, and were devoted to the hard business of number crunching, economics and military information, banking, et cetera. It had none of the cultural implications that computing later had. And really the first place we see that kind of turn is when these hackers start realizing that they can sort of make the machines do things that they weren't intended to do. And in some sense, that's kind of at the origin of the sense of hacking, where you're interacting with the system, you recognize certain affordances or potentials within that system that were probably not put there almost certainly not put there by the designers, and which can be explored partly just for the pure fun of it. So there's a sort of purposelessness or a kind of heretical purpose involved in it. So they started to make games, they started to screw around, they figured out how they could order pizza, et cetera, et cetera. So it's this kind of way of turning these monolithic systems of control and very serious information processing into sources of culture, of play, of interaction, and of novelty and exploration. And so that's sort of the origins of the hacker. And it goes through its own, complex transformation over the decades, particularly once the term becomes more widely used and increasingly associated with the dark arts. But we'll leave that aside for now. And then at some point recently, it becomes attached by this one fellow, who, not coincidentally in California, and who had studied at MIT, named Mikey Siegel. And he was interested in the connection a lot of us have talked about between technologies and spirituality, and to a degree psychedelics, and how those two wonderful phrases can be smashed together to create a lot of sparks and a lot of possibility. So for me, I really look at the term conscious hacking in a historical sense as indicating the way in which we can look at our own nervous system, and we can look at the systems that underlie consciousness and even consciousness itself as we experience it, as a system that has various affordances and potentials that we may not know about, and that exploring them with an almost impish spirit of exploration and experiment is one aspect of what it means to be awake and alive in the 21st century.
So I've actually been part of this consciousness hacking movement that Mikey Siegel started. Here I'm talking about dream tripping. I often talk about dream hacking. And I think it's a very interesting question for people who are interested in entheogens. How do they feel about using technologies in the way that we use drugs? I mean, we're a lot of hippies over here, and we're like, well, that sounds weird, right? So it goes the whole spectrum. So when I've been looking at technologies that are used, like drugs, used to influence dreams, it runs a gamut. I'm going to give you. This is a talk that I give, but I'm just going to give you the two examples at the far end of the spectrum. So there's something called transcranial direct current stimulation. The way that works is it's a constant low voltage of energy. You put it on the brain, and you put positive charge where you're interested in, in pinging. Priming is what it's called. And then you put negative charge in kind of what you want to calm down. So, for example, you're trying to learn to play piano, and you stimulate the motor cortex, and then you calm other parts of the brain. And the idea is that you are now more primed to learn the piano. It's not going to make the neurons fire, actually. It just is going to make them more likely to fire when you're doing what you would already do. And so this, transcranial direct current stimulation is used to stimulate parts of the brain that, for example, will bring on slow wave sleep. That's the deepest kind of sleep. People who have night terrors or certain kind of parasomnias, some sleepwalking or sleep talking, that kind of thing, have these in deep sleep, slow wave sleep. So sometimes they're trying to stimulate slow. It's also the kind of sleep that you can't live without. So, and there's also much more nefarious uses, like the government trying to stimulate slow wave sleep to make sure the soldiers get the sleep they need. So trying to condense it to, can you kind of get them to only sleep 4 hours and still be functional. Also used to stimulate the brain to bring on REM. So it can bring on dreaming, and a lot of people in the dreaming community have used both there's publicly available machines. You could go buy one, it's expensive, the Wallace Fisher machine, or you could make your own with an Arduino. But a lot of people in the dream community are actually making these machines, messing around, trying to get to lucid dreaming. So that's one end. And then the least innocuous is something like a phone app. There's a free phone app called Dream On that you can record sound, whatever you want, and then set it, and 5 hours after you've gone to sleep, when your REM starts to be really active, it'll play whatever music, song, your children laughing, your favorite song, birds, whatever it is to affect your dreams. And there's a whole spectrum of ways that technology can be used to hack consciousness, quite literally, hacking dreams in the case of what I study. It's a lot of people say, look, it's drugs, e-drugs. A lot of people call them e-drugs. So it's a very interesting, I think, issue to contemplate for us as a community, how we feel about that.
So I want to build on the definition of consciousness hacking that's been offered and expanded a little bit. One definition that the consciousness hacking group that Mikey Siegel founded is for the actual term is that, they acknowledge that there are many different ways to think about it, but they really like to emphasize consciousness hacking as they conceive it really does involve technology that is plugging something into a wall. Essentially, it is electrical. And I'm very interested in that intersection, but I'm also interested in thinking about that term in a larger sense. I think as someone who studied and enjoys studying Eastern religions and contemplative practices, I think if you really read a lot about these people, these meditators from India and China and Japan and other places, they really were hackers, They really were consciousness hackers in their own right. They were sitting around for all day long, for years, really generations, groups of people pioneering ways to hack your consciousness that even today, with all the amazing technologies we have, I would absolutely contend that many of the technologies they refined are some of the most potent tools we have for hacking consciousness. And there's something to kind of highlight here, I think. In the West, we often think about knowledge in objective terms, in scientific terms, and I'm totally a fan of that. If someone tells me a piece of information, whether it's about nutrition or something else, I want to know about double-blind clinical trials and all of that. But I think we need to honor as well subjective forms of knowledge, what it's like in terms of your own experience, and to recognize that there is a rational, empirical approach within the subjective realm. And that's a tradition that's been going on a long, long time, particularly in the East. An example of that would be, for example, you can read different things about the value of nutrition, but everyone's body's different. So you've got to really listen to the feedback from your own body and think what's right for you. But especially with consciousness, this is very pertinent because there's no way to step outside of consciousness. So the subjective experience of it is particularly a form to honor. And so I'm really interested in those techniques. And in particular, I think one that is extremely powerful, the most powerful way to alter your consciousness naturally, not including entheogens or psychedelics, is to alter your breath. And pranayama, which are yogic techniques, also Chinese Taoists have pioneered similar techniques, are some of the most powerful, and I'm very, very interested in those tools. And then I think you can kind of bring that back full circle and integrate it with modern technology. And I think we're just starting to get that technology available at a consumer level. But for example, you can wear an Apple Watch while you're doing pranayama and doing meditation, and be wearing a Muse headband, which measures the EEG waves on your brain as you're meditating and gives you that feedback and can give you that data and links to your smartphone and your smartwatch. So you can really use these more traditional techniques and integrate it with technology to aggregate data, which is really starting to manifest in things like the quantified self movement, where we can actually kind of aggregate this kind of data on ourselves and get a more accurate picture. And so I just encourage people to really think about hacking too in a larger term, where we're bridging more traditional forms of hacking with more modern technological forms.
Thank you. When I looked at the topic of this meeting, I wondered, what is it about? And thank you, Erik, for sort of letting me know what conscious hacking was. And I really appreciate your idea of extending it in new directions beyond just merely technological invention. I think consciousness hacking also ought to consider consciousness construction, that it's construction of different, I would call them mind-body states, not just interfering with the ones we have or slightly changing them, but actually interviewing, increasing, elaborating on our current mind-body states to create new ones. And then so hacking, I think, ought to be, I hope they have a subsidiary called consciousness construction or consciousness design, because we can now design our mind-body states rather than just start with the ones we have and have alternates to that. I think one of the problems with artificial intelligence is that it is entirely, or almost entirely, computer-oriented, but it's also possible to have a neural-based artificial intelligence. That is artificial intelligence by creating new mind-body states, not just by elaborating or trying to model the one that we currently have. So I'd like to see artificial intelligence, meaning the construction of new mind-body states, as part of the AI world.
Okay, so I feel a bit unsure about the term hacking and consciousness hacking, just from the point of view of if we think that hacking means using something in a way that it wasn't designed to be used. I actually think that we were kind of designed to explore different states of consciousness and to change our consciousnesses in this way. Studies from anthropology show that something like 97% of cultures around the world involve use of psychedelics and ritual as part of their traditions. And I think that, it kind of shows that that's sort of a part of being human. So I very much agree with what Adrian was saying, that when we think of the technologies that are associated with consciousness hacking, often it is these things like TCDS or neurofeedback and these very mechanical kinds of ideas. But I don't see too much of a difference between those technologies and older technologies, all of the traditions from meditation that Adrian was talking about, where you have these incredibly detailed descriptions of different states of consciousness and the methods and techniques that can be used to get to those states of consciousnesses. I mean, I think that is all technology. And if you look at it from a sort of historical perspective, I guess, for thousands of years, there have been those technologies that some people have been aware of and known. In our own culture, in Western culture, probably since the 60s and the counterculture revolution, those ideas have sort of been there and been prominent, things like yoga and meditation and those kinds of things. And then maybe just in the last 15 or 20 years, those things really are starting to become more and more accepted topics in mainstream science. So I think it might have been, I don't remember if it was Tom or Neshi last night was talking about behaviorism and how for a long time in psychology, it wasn't okay to talk about consciousness or introspection and those kinds of things. But now, consciousness is definitely a topic of investigation, and there really is a lot of serious science looking at psychedelics, as we all know about, but there's tons of science now on meditation, on states of flow, on all sorts of things that wouldn't have been acceptable topics before. And so I think that's a really positive development in terms of our broader conception of what consciousness hacking means. Yeah, might leave it at that.
The credit goes to Neshe.
That was Neshe.
And an interesting thing is that, as you pointed out, behavioral psychology had been against any sort of introspection. Mental was a dirty word. But what's happened now is there are two types of behaviorism that are very helpful. One is biofeedback, and the other is neurofeedback, where you can get a report on what the brain is doing and give a little positive reinforcement to that happening. So you learn to, by being reinforced for using different parts of your brain, learn to use those parts more skillfully when you want to.
Thank you. Let's build on this idea that Vince was saying about something you said reminded me of it. So one definition of hacking is one way to think about it. It's kind of as a shortcut, essentially. It's a quicker, more efficient way to a problem. And there's an interesting debate that's going on within the community where there's a lot of overlap between meditation and psychedelics. And there's a lot. I was actually just at a retreat where this was a very lively, topical discussion. And as some of you know, and the book was mentioned last night, I think by Rick Doblin, Zigzag Zen, which is a really great book to read for those of you who are interested in the history of, in the intersection of psychedelics and Eastern religions in the West. But basically, most of the people who got their start teaching meditation in the West did psychedelics at some point early on. Yet, it's quite controversial within some of these communities today to use psychedelics, in part, for example, in Buddhism, because the fifth precept, where you're not supposed to take intoxicating substances, and there's this debate about what that is. But I'd like us to discuss as a panel, at what point you can view a hack as a good thing, which is simply a more efficient way to get to a problem, or some people make this argument a lot with psychedelics that, a shortcut, for example, is something that in the long run is depriving you of harder won gains. You can go up, but you always come down is sort of what Ram Dass talks about learning. And so could we sort of tease out that discussion in terms of, is psychedelics a really potent tool that can sort of lead you to a higher truth and then you let go of it at some point? Or do you think that it's not necessarily a shortcut in a negative way?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one way maybe to think about that is if you think around some of the critiques around ayahuasca culture. So there's certainly people who feel apprehensive about lots of Westerners going and doing ayahuasca. And the idea is that, there's these people that are going and having these very powerful experiences, but then aren't able to integrate them too well. And so in that sense, the idea that someone can go and change their consciousness so profoundly can be questionable you wonder what they're trying to do by doing that. I think sometimes when people don't know what they're getting into, that can be quite a scary and tumultuous kind of experience. And so the opposite side of that is obviously people get many, many positive benefits from being involved in those sorts of experiences, and it can be wonderful and nourishing. But there is this sort of almost like consumerist drive sometimes to obtain these sorts of experiences to then get some, superpower or something like that. It's a very trivial way to talk about it, but I think that people get exposed to that idea and think that they can go and do something like that, and that changing their consciousness in that way is going to be the answer to a lot of problems in life. And that, I think, maybe fits in with other aspects of consciousness hacking as well. Oftentimes we have this drive to go and experience some conscious state, to do something because it's going to make us better or more well or something like that. That comes up in the microdosing a lot. The sort of cultural story around microdosing in some quarters is that, this is something that you do to become more productive and more efficient as a human. And there's this linking sometimes between experiencing another state of consciousness and that kind of obtaining of new things. And I think that's, it's an interesting kind of problem. I think it's important to think about, like, what is this drive that we have to altered states? Where does it come from, and how can we do it more cautiously and healthily?
Yeah, I think one way of approaching this and almost bringing it back to the core metaphor of hacking is to talk about the problem of instrumentality. So one way of characterizing what Western culture has done is to put forward a kind of notion of instrumentality, which is that using our reason, we can understand how the world works such that we can use things or deploy tools in order to achieve certain effects. And one critique of the West is that instrumentality, this kind of attitude, which obviously is very useful in many regions of life, has a tendency to take over entirely. And so partly what I hear Vince talking about is that there's a problem when we approach altered states, whether psychedelics, or this is also true of meditation, mindfulness in corporate culture is a whole other conversation to have, about the idea that we are doing these things in order to achieve purposes that the ego has clearly identified as something that it wants. And there's a dark side of that. And indeed, there's a dark side even of the metaphor of a tool. We might want to talk about meditation as a tool or psychedelics as a tool, and we're like, yeah, a tool for what? For what sort of purpose? Because the very relationship of a tool implies a tool user that knows what they want to do, that has a certain intent, that has a certain goal in mind. And those goals can be lofty, they can be integration, they can be harmony, they can be connecting with the earth. There's a lot of different kind of goals, but there's something even at the core of the idea of tool that tends to undercut what is another way of understanding these approaches or techniques, which is that they are ways of inviting an encounter. There are ways of experiencing what you don't know, or getting what you didn't expect, or opening space for the other to emerge. So, for example, in psychedelic experience, I might take some mushrooms to go out because I believe that I'm working on this problem, and if I work this out, I can become a happier person, more efficient in my life, and this is something I want. Great, that's fine. But I can also go on the same dose into the same, neck of the woods with the idea of I'm going to encounter what I'm going to encounter. I'm going to create a clearing for something else to arise that I don't know what it is. And my job is to be receptive and listening and intuitive and maybe take a risk on something that I don't know what I want. And this is also very much a discussion within meditation. I've done a number of different meditation regimes in my life, but the main one that I focused on or learned first and have stayed with is intentionally purposeless. It's intentionally without a goal, without, I'm going to keep doing this technique in order to achieve a certain state of quiet, and then from that quiet I'm going to achieve a certain kind of concentration, and then that concentration will bring on a bliss state. Those things are very powerful. I've worked with them, but I mostly just sit. And the minute I try to make it a project, get the project out of the way, let it dissolve. Where am I? Open, space, encounter, not knowing. And for me, this side of things is very important, both to meditation and psychedelics, and to being alive. And so one of the questions that sort of bringing it up larger in terms of this issue of how do we think about instrumentality, how do we think about what, just sort of achieving what the ego's goals are, is that we need to kind of question even the fundamental metaphor of the tool, that there's something there that we are hacking, and to recognize that implies certain limitations that we may not even be aware of.
But even within that realm, so hacking itself, right, as language comes from the popularity of computer code, right? Hacking code. And that's why everyone talks about hacking now, dream hacking, consciousness hacking, whatever it is. And if you think about hacking, it has both a very positive and a negative connotation, right? So hackers are the people who go in and fuck with things, right? I mean, you're going and hacking something, the governmental website or whatever. but hacking is also this very useful. It's a playful going in and experimenting. If you short circuit this and put it here and do it with this, then what happens? And this, there is the idea of instrumentality, but there's also the people who are very serious consciousness hackers would just say, like, as Adrian said, consciousness doesn't stop, right? You can't get outside of consciousness. It's always kind of rolling along. So there's also, for a lot of people who are interested in this idea, it's a very playful, what happens when you do this? What happens when you do this? If you short circuit this code, kind of what happens if you do this? And that's one way that you can think about the hacking, like the doing as opposed to the non-doer, right? But the doing, but that isn't necessarily goal-centric. And I think a lot of people do try to roll with it that way.
One of the nice things I felt about my own psychedelic experiences, it took me a while to learn, is, after my first supplement, I thought, well, I'm going to listen to this music, and I'm going to go here, I'm going to look at this picture, and have all these intentions going in, and know just what I wanted to do on the trip, and then spend an hour and a half looking at the back of my thumbnail. Now, I think this is an example of the unexpected happening and being open to experience, whether you like it or not. And I think probably this is, since psychedelics can be used in a number of different ways, they can be used as tools functionally, they can be used just openness. We're likely to never say that psychedelics should be used this way or the other way. And we're getting very much into the question of the ethics and values of doing psychedelics. And the one that I understand you criticizing is basically the wealth, power, and fame triad, which is one of the three big ones that we get in this culture. Clearly, some people can use psychedelics in that direction. Some people intend to use it that direction, and they don't. And some people don't intend to use it in that direction, and they do. And there's the fourth of the don't. So all these things, I think, we don't have a lot of control of. I think a lot of the reason that people have, quote, on bad trips is that they get caught in not having their expectations met. So it's the expectation that really determines what a trip is, although as I point out in my own experience, my expectations usually don't fulfill themselves.
I think a lot of the points that have been made really relate to a central thing which is happening in sort of other debates. And this very much links to sort of the integration talk that's been coming up a lot more about in the psychedelic community, the need to talk more about integration. I think a lot of the problem is when a technology is taken out of its original context and it's exported or imported into another context. What often is missing in that transition is you're not bringing along the other things that were part of that original ecosystem, that were part of that original supporting structure. So leaving aside just for a second, I like what you said about the problems with thinking about it as a tool. Let's just think about whether you want to say tool or technology, whether we're talking about meditation as a tool or technology or psychedelics, each of those were enmeshed in a very clear, larger system of beliefs and practices. So for example, when you learn different meditation techniques, there's a rhyme and a reason why you were learning certain techniques at certain stages. People just didn't sit around and your teacher wasn't teaching you things randomly. There's a real order, for example, for those of you who have ever done a yoga teacher training, right? You always learn Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, and Patanjali is always about the order in which you learn certain things. And some people have a really hardcore view on that. No, you shouldn't even learn pranayama until you learn asana and yamas and niyamas because it's so powerful. I'm not quite that diehard, but I do think that if you look at psychedelics, whether it's ayahuasca, right, that's clearly part of this ritual. And then people take that out of that original structure and they use it in an apartment in Brooklyn or San Francisco. And the stories you hear, right? I mean, things can very easily go south. And we think about LSD. LSD, we don't think about as this natural plant medicine as part of an indigenous culture. But what was the ecosystem in which LSD was originally in? A psychiatrist's office. So it very much was in a supporting structure. And a similar thing for meditation. Meditation teachers would absolutely scold any student who was just going around, aimlessly trying different techniques. Intention is so important, and as well as integration work after. So perhaps we can start to talk about what's the importance of integration, what's the importance of intention, and how do we integrate psychedelic experiences meaningfully, and how do we feel there is a certain limit around the conversation in the psychedelic community today.
I could talk a little bit about the integration process, because we're in a very funny time where there's objective values in the sense of moral or ethical values are very hard to talk about. We have a sense of what it means to be good or right or whatever, but no one really wants to impose it, at least on the in the progressive space where most of this exploration with meditation and psychedelics is taking place. So I'm sort of leaving aside the whole conservative reaction to a lot of this openness and exploration. But it's a funny problem. Like, so what do you do with it? Like, we don't have a homogeneous tribal structure. I mean, it's actually quite funny when you think about it, how much we can approach our psychedelic experience as a sort of way into a kind of tribal reality that we don't live at all. Whether we're fantasizing about it or whether we do the hard work of actually going and trying to connect with people and really learn traditions and work with traditional healers, or whether we know people who do that and are influenced by what they say, or even in our sort of fantasies or our celebrations, our creativity with the festival as a kind of tribalism. So the sense that we're actually all one in the dance, or that we have that homogeneity. And it's a weird word, homogeneity. We don't really like homogeneous, doesn't sound so good. But anthropologically, that's the way you're going to have to describe most of the situations where these practices arise, is that everybody around you is in the same kind of system. And while some of those people recognize that what they're deploying are tools, the shaman knows that he can play this trick with the crystal, or he can, bring out a bull roar at just the right time, because these are techniques, they're special effects that deployed in the right situation can produce an effect. Most of the people in the situation are not thinking about them as tools. They're instruments of his power or her magic. So we're in a funny place because we kind of have this desire for that. We recognize the value of it, and yet we don't actually possess it. So the work of integration for me it means something more than just individually working with the consequences of your experience, particularly the difficult consequences. Most people don't want to deal with the difficult consequences. They'll just put them aside and go, oh, well, that was a bad part, and then I had a blissful thing, and I saw this beautiful being, and like, oh, great, okay, now I'm doing something good. Well, actually, I think a lot of the work's in the shadow side. But how do you work with it? Just sitting there alone and kind of thinking through, or maybe with a therapist? Yeah, that can do a certain good. But there's something really powerful that happens when you do it in group. And I've been part of these integration circles where a dozen or so people get together, and each person kind of asks a question, kind of presents their issue, asks for feedback or not. And there's this very interesting collective space that starts to build where we recognize that we're all in it together and that we don't really know. We don't really have a homogeneous set of answers. It's the opposite of a guru scene where somebody's telling you what things mean. And that openness and that kind of existential exploration is really part of where we are right now. But it has to happen, in my experience, in community, particularly community with other people you don't know. So creating safe spaces where people who don't know can go in and talk about difficult experiences, because I think it's in that process that we start to build a larger collective sense that's really meaningful and deep. It's easy to be blissed out on the dance floor and we're all one, and you're like, oh great, I've achieved that tribal identity and I'm in bliss and this is what life is about, or whatever. That's great. It's a wonderful thing to do. But that's not really where we build that kind of sense of interconnection. I think it's in gatherings like this, and then in particularly the work of integrating, and again, particularly integrating the challenging sides of these experiences.
I'm quite in favor of cultural adaptation. I mean, after all, that happened with the hand axe, the Indo-European languages, and Arabic numerals. We don't do our multiplication with Roman numerals. And if we were going to be culturally pure, we would probably use Roman numerals to try to multiply. But you mentioned integration. We're good at psychotherapy and having integration sessions after the psychotherapeutic sessions. And now we have to work on the same problem culturally. What are the cultural adaptations? And clearly what's right for other cultures is probably not going to be right for us. So we're at the stage now of trying to figure out how do we integrate these things in a cultural-wide basis, not just a theoretical, theological basis. Well, let me say also that there are problems. We are very good at integration of after sessions in a psychotherapy session. We have not looked at the problem of what does integration mean in the intellectual area or in the religious area. And these problems we have yet to solve.
You know, I'm thinking of a question, and I'm hoping I can clarify, because I think we're close to it, which is that if we're not in a traditional situation where we know what the goal is, we become aware of these techniques and technologies, that they can produce effects, that they can produce amazing things. How do we go about exploring those possibilities while avoiding the magnetic pull of, let's call it the ego, or wealth and fame and sex, or, I mean, in a negative kind of acquisitive sense, or in the way in which you talk about consuming experience? I mean, our whole culture is based on consuming experience, more and more intense experiences, and the culture itself is growing more and more kind of psychedelic in that sense. How do we, without having a clear sense of, you know, liberation, a certain religious notion of compassion, these might be influences, but clearly we're in a space where there's no one set of what a goal would be. How do we explore, open up, integrate, and not, given the absence of those kind of goals, fall back on these patterns of egoic consumption or egoic expansion and identification?
I don't really know, but perhaps one thing might be for us to try and be cautious about how we sort of see our own agency as we go into these consciousness hacking kinds of experiences. Like, maybe not to try and stop ourselves expecting that the altered state itself is going to, you know, give us what we want and change us permanently, and seeing these more as tools for insight, but maybe not tools for instant change.
Or even just the idea that the hacking itself is kind of the point, right? It's the activity of going in and trying to play with it and trying to experiment and seeing what happens when you mess with the code. And rather than the outcome, it's the actual process.
I think this is a really good question you raised about, and it gets to this point about, you know, what's the difference between the technology and the path? You know, or what's your intention, what's the goal? And there's no one answer there. We can think about, you know, I think connection to the divine or a mystical experience, if you want to think about it in secular terms, like merging with consciousness. That's absolutely a great intention. I think one important goal for every human being is emotional intelligence, developing emotional intelligence. And the framework I would refer people to, if you're not familiar with him, is Daniel Goleman, looking at his model for emotional intelligence. So he talks about interpersonal versus intrapersonal. And so just within yourself, there's developing self-awareness. And as you develop more self-awareness, you're able to manage your emotions more effectively. And then intrapersonal, as you develop more social awareness of what's going on around you, you're able to manage those relationships effectively. I think that mindfulness, meditation, is a tool for cultivating that attention you need to have self-awareness, which then leads you into better self-management of your emotions, developing that space between stimulus and response so that you're able to act more skillfully in the world. And I think this is where psychedelics have a lot of value. You know, you get insight into your personality. You're able to look into destructive patterns. You're able to let things go. You're able to forgive. You're able to heal past wounds. This is why LSD was used originally in a psychiatrist's office, and we're finding out through research a lot of the same things we already knew it was good for in the 1950s. You know, and we're just starting to pick back up on that work again. But I think that's really important to think about that larger goal, and I think it really is about emotional intelligence, waking up not only for the benefit of yourself, but for other people as well. And I think the question you have to ask yourself is, why do you meditate, or why do you do psychedelics? You know, and I don't think there's anything wrong with being honest with yourself about the fact you're drawn to a peak experience. But you need to, one, be honest with yourself that you're drawn to a peak experience and have a little awareness into your personality about that point. And then I think you need to ultimately ask yourself, how is this changing me? You know, what am I like when I'm not on psychedelics? What am I like when I'm not meditating or doing yoga? Are you a nicer person? Are you more self-aware? Are you kinder to other people? Because if you're not, while I don't think there's anything wrong with recreational use of psychedelics, after a while I would begin to ask yourself, what really is the value of using that to your life?
As far as I know, everything that's been developed has been used for both good and bad. And we have to look at how psychedelics are going to fall into that. We are mostly aware of their positive uses, but that's no reason to suppose that they can only be used in a positive way.
You know, Vince, I know that your work is about agency, and a lot of our conversations have kind of turned on that. And indeed, for me, some of the most profound moments, both of psychedelics and in deep meditation, is sort of becoming aware of the agent in both the way that agency is telling a story about itself that may not be the case, and that also that there, nonetheless, no matter how far out you are, or how much you feel like you're just a robot of impulses, or you see that your ego doesn't really know anything or do anything, there's still something about agency. There's still something about the move one makes, or a gesture, a turn, whatever. So I just love to hear you talk a little bit about how you've come to think about agency in these different contexts.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of topic. So one of the things that I've done is try and come up with ways of measuring someone's feeling of agency, how in control they're feeling of the current moment, how much they, compared to like how much they feel like the events that are occurring are caused by external sort of stimuli or forces. For example, in the microdosing research, that was one of the things that seemed to change for people who microdosed over a period of a couple of months, is that on the one hand, they reported feeling less like the events in the world were caused by external forces and more like they were sort of controlling the things that were happening in their life, which I think is a positive thing. But that it also showed up that people were reporting more experiences similar to like a state of flow, where they felt that things were also just unfolding automatically. So it seems a little bit paradoxical, but I think they're actually two different aspects of agency. And so I think that those sorts of changes in the way that we see our role in, you know, interacting with events in the environment, I think that does change a lot in different altered states of consciousness. And a lot of these consciousness hacking techniques, maybe some of the appeal of them is that they do let us feel more present in what's happening in the world. So yeah, I don't know what else to say about it really. I mean, in other altered states, for example, something like hypnosis, one of the defining features of that state while someone is hypnotized is a reduction in agency. Someone doesn't feel as much like they're controlling what's happening. In that situation, whatever the suggestions are, the person is more likely to respond. But you can also use hypnosis to increase agency in positive ways as well, not so much in the moment in the hypnosis session, but people who go for effective hypnotherapy will learn new tools to respond to stimuli out in the world afterwards that do give them more control. So it's almost like you can have that intention and work on it in that situation, and then the payoff is much later. So it's almost like having this planning of your self-control going forward into the future.
It's interesting, this question is really coming up a lot, this sort of control versus a kind of a go with it. And again, when you're thinking about hacking, sometimes you're hacking something for a very specific goal. I'm hacking this to make this happen. I want to control my consciousness. And sometimes you're hacking to see what happens, right? I'm messing with the code, I'm messing with the experience to see what happens. And it's the same action in a way. So intention is really the thing that's making the difference in a way that's very, very different.
In this forum this morning and yesterday and elsewhere, it appears that people talk about experiences they have on psychedelics or meditation or whatever is something that is happening to them rather than being part of them. and there's also the when people talk about bad trips or difficult trips, it's because they've done something wrong in terms of preparation, rather than the psyche being ready and saying, well, here you go, this is something that you should probably be looking at. So with that in mind, when you're having a difficult experience, it's really you're having a difficult experience of yourself that probably really needs healing, rather than stating it as something that has come your way because of the spirits didn't like the way you set it up.
Therapeutic sessions, it's very common for the monitor or monitors when the client or patient says, I'm having this wonderful experience, this drug is doing all those wonderful things for me, for the monitor to say, no, you are doing that to you. The drug is just helping you do it.
I just interviewed Dennis McKenna on my podcast, and so I'll defer to a great expert on ayahuasca, Dennis McKenna, who said, you know, people often say about this language of ayahuasca healed me. And I mean, I even use that language myself, but he said, no, ayahuasca didn't heal you. You know, you healed you. Only you're going to do that. And ayahuasca may help you do that, but you really need to embrace that mentality. And I think one thing that you bring up in terms of the language around I doing this, I mean, the ego is very strong, you know, it's very rigid. We have this very firm sense of ourself as the doer of our actions. And I think as we use psychedelics more, or as we go deeper into meditation, upon much closer inspection, we realize that sense of I really, the notion that there's a coherent, structured self really breaks down upon further inspection, but that is a practice to which we continually have to return, and it's a fact that we very easily forget.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the second idea of how to deal with the dark side. And it's a very interesting tension between how do you set up, so using set and setting, a positive situation that is more likely to encourage helpful, healing, enjoyable experiences, versus a kind of radical openness that is even willing to not follow those rules and roll the dice on having difficult experiences, like, yeah, let's take acid and go to the mall, or whatever. One way I think about it when you ask that question, what popped in my mind is that recently I was taking a walk through the wilderness in California and turned a corner and there were a bunch of rattlesnakes, and they just, you know, it was pretty close, not actually dangerous, but, you know, dangerous enough. And my instant reaction was, blessing. And I was like, God, that was a cool response. Like, I didn't choose to have that in mind. Like, oh, I said it was a blessing. It was like, that was just what happened. Like, blessing. Like seeing a jewel. And that's all psychedelics. That's all being able to go, when those difficulties arise, is to go, a blessing. Because you're seeing something. And if you keep that, that's also where mindfulness is really key. Mindfulness is wonderful at being able to stay with what is actually happening and to let go of those expectations. So to some degree, I think those expectations of having a positive trip, and particularly the idea that you're at fault if something bad happens, even if sometimes you are. You know, you had a dumb idea. That was dumb to take the acid and go to the mall. That once you're there, buddy, so let's work with it and try to see, because there's always insight there. You know, there's always insight, even in the difficult things, unless you're whatever. There's extremes where, you're not there anymore, but
Alex,
I think that's important to do.
Alex Gray has this great idea of psychedelics as practice for the bardo, right? I mean, Tibetan Buddhists say the same thing with lucid dreaming, trying to go to the place, because, as you know, and I think most of you have, if you've had these experiences, there's going to be fear. Fear will arise. Frightening things will arise. And so you learn to ride through it. Okay, this is going to be okay. I'm just going to be chill through this part. That's all right. So psychedelics, lucid dreaming, whatever it is, really can be a thing that keeps you cool through the hard stuff.
My question was just related to something Ram Dass has brought up, which you mentioned, which is, I guess, the subtle but important difference between getting high and being high. and what it means, and what that means. And that's something that I've been meditating on, and I wonder if you could discuss what that means as psychedelics, as, you know, personally for me, useful almost as an initiatory thing, because, you know, so much of us are so thick and crap in the West, and so it's good to see the white light. But then now that you've seen it, you inevitably will come down if it comes externally. So what to do and what it means to be high, and how that would relate to psychedelic use, integration, and a broader practice.
There are a couple things to say. I mean, one thing that's really important that, you know, and Ram Dass talks about this a lot, in that he's still a big believer in the value of psychedelics, but, you know, the problem, he always says that no matter how high he went, he always came down. And so Ram Dass would certainly be, I think, one of those people who would say, you know, you do need to sort of evolve these other techniques. And I know he did continue to use psychedelics occasionally until much, much later in his life. It turned into more of a once every year or two kind of experience. But one really important thing that his teacher, Neem Karoli Baba, taught him was the whole idea, and not just about getting versus being high, but the notion of love. Love not having an object and not needing someone to receive, not needing to receive love from someone, but just being in a state of love. And how do you do that? You know, obviously easier said than done, but that comes from within. The mistake we make is when we expect that happiness, that fulfillment, that love to come from other people. For other people to give us that, and for other people to make us whole, as opposed to us doing that work ourselves. And that's whether it's another person, whether it's a drug, whatever it is. I really think it's about finding contentment within. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you so much, guys. Please give a big round of applause for our most excellent panelists.